What does it take for a prince to marry a woman he actively despises? For the future King of England, the price was his freedom. Drowning in a mountain of debt, Prince George was given a scandalous ultimatum: marry a German princess he'd never even met, or face total financial ruin. This is the story of a forced marriage, born from desperation and instant disgust, that became one of the greatest scandals to ever hit the British crown. But was it just a loveless union, or was it a tragedy that sealed a queen's fate from the moment she said, "I do"? Before he was King George IV, he was simply the Prince of Wales, or Prinny, to his friends. And Prinny had a problem. Several, actually. He was a man of extravagant tastes, a patron of the arts, and a leader of high fashion. He commissioned grand buildings and threw legendary parties, but this lifestyle came at a staggering cost. By 1795, he had racked up debts of around £630,000, an astronomical sum for the time. His father, King George III, had had enough, and so had Parliament. They offered him a deal, an ultimatum really: they'd clear his debts, but only if he agreed to marry a suitable Protestant princess and produce an heir to the throne. There was just one tiny complication. The prince was already married. 10 years earlier, in 1785, he'd secretly and illegally wed the love of his life, a Catholic widow named Maria Fitzherbert. The marriage was invalid under the Royal Marriages Act because it lacked the king's consent, and his bride's Catholic faith would have barred him from ever taking the throne. For Parliament, this secret marriage was a convenient illegality. It meant that, in the eyes of the law, the prince was a bachelor. For George, it meant he had to cast aside the woman he adored to save his own fortune. The stage was set for a union based not on love, but on cold, hard cash. His chosen bride? His own first cousin from Germany, Princess Caroline of Brunswick. He had never met her. Caroline arrived in England full of hope, but her reception was beyond icy. The queen was cold, the court was dismissive, and her future husband was utterly repulsed. Their very first meeting has become the stuff of legend. Upon seeing his bride-to-be, who Lord Malmesbury had noted had poor hygiene and rarely changed her clothes, George embraced her, then immediately turned away, retreated to the far corner of the room, and demanded a glass of brandy. Caroline was equally unimpressed. She later confided that the prince was very fat and he's nothing like as handsome as his portrait. The disgust was instant and mutual. To make a horrific situation even worse, George decided to twist the knife. In a calculated act of humiliation, he appointed his own mistress, the Countess of Jersey, to be Caroline's lady of the bedchamber. This forced his new wife to be served by the very woman he actually favored. It was a declaration of war before the wedding had even begun. The wedding took place on April 8, 1795, at the Chapel Royal in St. James's Palace. It was, in a word, a disaster. George had spent the 3 days leading up to the ceremony in a complete haze of brandy. He showed up to the altar so drunk that he could barely stand, and had to be propped up by his groomsmen. During the vows, he was seen weeping, and at one point, he stood up as if he was about to make a run for it. In stark contrast, Caroline arrived looking every bit the princess, clearly determined to see the nightmare through. But her composure couldn't save the ceremony from the spectacle of its groom. The man who was supposed to be the future King of England looked, as one observer noted, like a man doing a thing in desperation. This wasn't a marriage, it was a public humiliation for everyone involved, broadcast under the Holy Sacrament. If you can believe it, the wedding night was even more catastrophic than the ceremony. According to Caroline's own account, the prince was so drunk that upon entering the bridal chamber, he promptly collapsed into the fireplace and remained there, passed out, until morning. She said she just left him there. George's version was different. He later claimed they did consummate the marriage and implied she wasn't a virgin, but the core fact remains undisputed: the union was a catastrophe from the very first moment. Somehow, in the midst of all this drunken loathing, duty was done. Prince George claimed they only had relations 3 times in total. But it was enough. Exactly 9 months minus a day later, on January 7, 1796, Caroline gave birth to their one and only child, Princess Charlotte. With an heir produced, George had fulfilled his side of the bargain with Parliament. He now had his money, and he saw no further need for his wife. Within weeks, the marriage had completely disintegrated. Just a year after the wedding, George sent Caroline a blunt note, informing her that she could live as she pleased, because he would not be having relations with her ever again. Caroline reportedly took this as her official permission to live her own life, and by 1797, they were living permanently apart. But George's cruelty was relentless. While he returned to his mistresses, first Lady Jersey and then Maria Fitzherbert again, he subjected Caroline to constant scrutiny and suspicion. He severely restricted her access to their daughter, Charlotte, and when Caroline adopted a small boy, the prince became obsessed with proving the child was her illegitimate son. He even launched a secret government inquiry known as the Delicate Investigation. The investigation ultimately cleared her, but the damage to her reputation was done. The cruelest blow, however, came years later, in 1817. Their daughter, Princess Charlotte, who was beloved by the public and seen as the bright future of the monarchy, died tragically in childbirth. In a final, devastating act of spite, George refused to even write to Caroline to inform her of their daughter's death. She was left to hear the news from a passing courier. On January 29, 1820, King George III died, and Prinny ascended the throne as King George IV. By law, this automatically made Caroline the queen consort. But George refused to accept it. He forbade his ambassadors from recognizing her as queen and ordered the Church of England to remove her name from its prayers. He was determined to simply erase her. But Caroline refused to be erased. She returned to England from her self-imposed exile in Europe to claim her rights, and the public erupted in support of her. Furious, George made his final move. Its purpose was simple and brutal: to strip Caroline of the title of queen and dissolve their marriage on the grounds of adultery with her Italian servant, Bartolomeo Bergami. In effect, this bill would put the queen on public trial. The trial became a national sensation, lasting 52 days and completely dominating the headlines. The government presented witnesses whose testimony was shaky at best, while Caroline's defense, led by the brilliant politician Henry Brougham, tore their arguments to shreds. But the real trial was happening in the court of public opinion. The people despised King George IV for his decadence, his selfishness, and his breathtaking hypocrisy in persecuting his wife for the same thing he was famous for. Caroline became an unlikely hero, a symbol for a growing radical movement that was demanding political reform. The press portrayed her as a wronged wife and the king as a debauched tyrant. In an unprecedented wave of political engagement, women marched and signed petitions in her support, outraged by the double standard that condemned her while ignoring the king's notorious promiscuity. As the writer Jane Austen put it, "Poor woman, I shall support her as long as I can, because she is a woman and because I hate her husband." The government saw the writing on the wall. The Pains and Penalties Bill was dangerously unpopular. It narrowly passed one vote in the House of Lords, but facing massive public unrest and the near certainty it would fail in the House of Commons, the government withdrew it. The people had won. The Queen was saved. This royal clash became a pivotal moment, showing that the power of the people could truly challenge the power of the crown. If you find these hidden histories as fascinating as we do, make sure to subscribe and hit the like button. And don't forget to ring the notification bell so you never miss another story of royal scandal and rebellion. Though Caroline had won the legal and public battle, George would have the last, cruel laugh. On July 19, 1821, at his lavish coronation, he gave explicit orders to bar her from entering. When Caroline arrived at Westminster Abbey, she was physically turned away, the doors slammed shut in her face in front of the entire world. It was the final humiliation. Just 3 weeks later, on August 7, 1821, Caroline fell ill and died. She was 53 years old. Her will requested that her tomb bear the inscription, "Here lies Caroline, the injured Queen of England." The marriage of George and Caroline was more than just a domestic disaster, it was a national tragedy. It began with the prince's desperate need for money and ended by shaking the very foundations of the monarchy. A union born of instant disgust spiraled into a public spectacle of cruelty, hypocrisy, and rebellion, forever marking a chapter in British history where a wronged queen and an angry populace put a powerful king in his place.